Hi, this is Steve Phillips.
Steve Phillips, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Absolutely fantastic. Very excited to talk with you because, until I put my nose inside these pages, I didn't realize the Civil War is not over yet.
Well, that's why I wrote the book.
Oh, my God. This is such an educational tool because it opens up your eyes and your heart to, hey, wow, there really is a story in the real world here, and here's why it might be happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I started out in many ways just looking at this, using the Civil War as a metaphor for understanding the division and the polarization that we were facing. But the more I dug into the research, I saw that the Confederates and their ideological and genealogical heirs have literally never stopped fighting.
Yeah.
So from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, 5 days after the supposed surrender at Appomattox, all the way up through January 6th and today.
So you were a student all the way through this book then, weren't you?
Yeah, it was a very educational process. A lot of things I did not know until I dug into the research, right? Everybody knows Lincoln was assassinated. We don't know exactly when and why, right? So you had the surrender on a Sunday in April 1865. 2 days later, he gives a speech talking about limited voting rights for African Americans in Louisiana. John Wilkes Booth is at that speech, says that means N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever give. And then on that Friday went into Ford Theater and shot Lincoln in the back of his head. So that's not surrendering in terms of ending the Civil War. So I learned a lot going through this, and so I've tried to distill it into the pages of the book and share it to help frame up and understand what is at stake in this critical election year in 2024.
It's amazing how, it's one of the things that we learned as martial artists is that I cannot be a solid black belt today unless I understand the history of the people before me. This is exactly what we're taught in that martial arts class, is that where we are today, we need to learn where we came from in order to change what it is that we need to change today.
Exactly. Fundamentally, it's just a existential election around, is this going to be a multiracial democracy? Are we going to keep moving forward, or are we going to go back to this primarily being a country for white people? And that has been fundamental to our politics far longer than we realize and than we would want to acknowledge. George Wallace ran for president in 1968. Strom Thurmond, who ran in 1948 on a segregationist platform, and then the Confederacy itself, right? 11 states seceded from the Union because they wanted to be able to buy and sell black people. Wow. So this has been a long stand. And so when you have people like, Donald Trump defending people like Robert E. Lee and people from the Confederacy, that's what they're saying, is that those champions of this being a white country are the people who should be celebrated. And that defines what we're going to be determining this year.
As an author, as an activator, and a teacher, how do you prepare for that moment of what if we go back? I mean, because I write about that a lot. What if? And I don't want to create a fake story. Right.
Well, history is instructive in that regard, right? So that's also the advantage of being able to step back and write and try to quantify or try to explain what actually happened, right? So the South seceded from the Union after an election in which the candidate who was backed by black people won, and they refused to accept the election results.
Yep.
And so that's not so unfamiliar to what we're actually grappling with here, right?
Do you ever wonder what state is going to back out? I always think it's going to be Texas. But as a child, though, up in Montana, I always thought it was going to be the Pacific Northwest that was going to break free.
Well, all of them have tried, right? Yeah. I mean, Oregon had passed laws saying that you couldn't have any black people come into the state. Well, they passed those laws, and that Texas, well, and certainly then Florida, they have been flaunting the authority of the federal government even currently. So certainly those governors would be candidates for trying to defy the legitimacy of the United States government. But the underappreciated point that I'm trying to lift up in the book is actually those governors don't actually represent the majority of the people, right? Texas's population is 61% people of color.
Yeah.
51% of the eligible voters are people of color. So that is kind of the point. What I'm saying is if you focus on democracy and groups getting people out to vote, you can actually transform the policies, the priorities, and the leaders and the direction of these states and the country.
I wish I could have been a fly on the wall when this came out of you onto that computer screen. Creating a multiracial society. Keep the White House, flip the House, and hold the Senate. Because that right there takes really deep in the soul thinking to be able to put something like that together.
Yeah, no, it was a great process, and it was, I wrote it during the height of the pandemic as well, and so it was very. And I studied history and African American history in particular when I was in college. I was like surrounded by all these books during the writing of the process, and I particularly was drawing from Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste was a real muse of mine, and so I was trying to honor a tradition of people who have written about this country's history and the real challenge that it faces, and try to do so in a way that lived up to that standard. So it was a very deep process for me, and I'm really glad to have brought it to conclusion and now get it out into the world. In what you've studied, why is it that most people are ignored who want a multiracial country? Well, it's a very powerful communications machine within this country that, in terms of who controls the platforms and the entities that shape public opinion. Right now, I was listening to this podcast recently about even in terms of Hollywood, right? Who are the lead actors? How much of that is, men versus women? How much of that is whites versus people of color? So the images that get shaped and reinforced are determined by people who, at best don't have the experience or the commitment towards reflecting the full diversity. And even if we just had the Oscars, so American Fiction, I remember listening to a podcast about that. Yeah. They couldn't get that movie made. Most of the studios were passed on it. It took an African-American studio executive at Orion to say, no, I'm going to make this movie. And so that shows the structural barriers to being able to get stories told and then to shape public opinion in ways that reflect the full, accurate diversity of the country. Is this book also available in audio, like on Odyssey? And the reason why is because I want people to either read this or listen to it while they're driving in the car, because there's so much great information inside this book. Yes, it's available in all forms. Audible, there's an audio book. The paperback is with the revised paperback was out today, and Kindle and iBooks, and so it's on all the different platforms. Being where you are now, with this book being relinquished to the public like this, I mean, what is it like for you to know that there's change on the way? When you read these pages, you can't help but change and expect those changes to take place. Yeah, well, it's very encouraging, and that's why I think the first part of the book, I really lay out how the Confederates have not stopped fighting from the end of the Civil War up to today. But the second part, I lay out our examples of where we have won, right? Andrea Guerrero in San Diego, she had asked me what was I, most excited about in the book, and I thought about it. I said, for so long, people are always saying, well, this kind of diversity, multiracial stuff, that's fine, but we have to win. So that has to take a back seat. And I was like, no, we're winning. We've won in San Diego and Harris County and Arizona and Georgia and Virginia. We're winning. And so I'm excited to tell that story. And that's what I'm most excited about right now. Can you imagine if you would have tried to share this story inside today's media? I mean, how they would have shut you down, or they would have edited it down so much just to protect their foundation? Yeah, no, that remains a challenge on an ongoing basis. Yeah. That's how I write, 2 columns and try to, I've had sometimes things published, something like the New York Times or Washington Post, but also you run up against, even, I don't want to say well-intentioned, but non-malicious, but structural biases around what stories they think are most important and whose views should be most put out there. So it is a very significant challenge. And so I'm really, grateful to the New Press for publishing this and be able to get it out into the world. I could totally see you on a lecture tour. You got one of those planned? So I am on tour now. I was in Portland at the Unitarian Universalist last week. I'm going to be in Massachusetts and with the Boston ACLU. And so people can follow along at stevephillips.com. We lay out where we're going to be going and events we're going to be doing. Man, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future, Steve. The door is always going to be open for you. I appreciate it. You bet. Well, you be brilliant today, okay? Thanks. You take care.